The movie industry has many eras of film, from the French New Wave to Italian Neo-realism. But in today's video, we are going to look at an American era of film that was defined as the Blaxploitation era. On this journey, we will look back at the inception of Blaxploitation films and the impact it had on American movies. To fully understand the idea of the Blaxploitation era of film, we must understand why this era in cinema even came about. Before Blaxploitation films were even an idea, the American film industry was at the heights of Hollywood power, with such filmmakers as Alfred Hitchcock and Sidney Lumet dazzling audiences with their storytelling ability. But there wasn't any room for black filmmakers to make their mark on Hollywood. Many African American actors had to take the sidekick roles, and especially for African American women, they were cornered to only play the mammy role, which was basically a stereotype role, where women of colour play characters who worked in a white family and nursed the family's children, a position that is rooted in American slavery. That lack of representation in Hollywood was only half the catalyst. The other half came from the Black Power movement, which between the 60s and 70s was at its boiling point, with Martin Luther King Jr. heading more of a peaceful protest against racial discrimination, while Malcolm X demanded a more hands-on approach. Their goals, however, were singular, and that was to get America to treat black Americans as equals. The height of the Black Power movement was at the rare end of the 1960s, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and riots began to mount across America. These were testing times for the United States. African Americans wanted to be heard and wanted to be treated as equally as their white counterparts. And this wasn't only in society, this crept into the film industry and became the moment where African Americans started to take their artistic value seriously, and thus began the explosion of films that were about black characters. This part of cinema was named the Blaxploitation era of Hollywood. To put it simply, Blaxploitation is a subgenre of movies where our hero is either a black man or black woman, and they can range from any type of genre, from horror, romance, and to the very popular action flick. The name Blaxploitation was first coined in 1972 by then Junius Griffin, president of the Beverly Hills Hollywood branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or better known as NAACP for short. It is highly regarded that the first film to be from the Blaxploitation era is 1971's Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, written and directed by Melvin Van Peebles. This film follows Sweetback, played by Melvin himself, a prostitute who saves a Black Panther member from two racist cops. The movie was a financial hit, grossing $4 million with only having a budget of $500,000. This was the proof Hollywood studios needed that having a film focused around an African American can be a hit with the domestic audiences. Thus, the influx of Blaxploitation movies came steamrolling in, with the movie Shaft releasing later on that year in 1971. Often the movies that followed would heavily use violence, drugs and sex to tell their story, as seen with the pioneer of Blaxploitation, Sweetback, having its main character to be a prostitute. However, over the years the film's main lead tended to be stylized as a pimp figure who was always fighting against the man, a slang term to identify the establishment that oppresses the black community. This representation was held with criticism, with many audiences and critics saying that the portrayal of black men as pimps was damaging the reputation of real black men. But we will get to the criticism later on. Because what became noticeable with many Blaxploitation films was they all had a similar style with the way they edit to the music they used. When it came down to the soundtracks, a lot of the films in this era used a new style of funk instead of what was heard before. This new style of funk had a uniqueness that instinctively came synonymous with Blaxploitation films. They were bass heavy with funky beats to keep the movie flowing at its relentless fast-paced editing. While doing some research, I found a pattern that saw many movies from the Blaxploitation era had a runtime of mostly 1 hour and 30 minutes, keeping a continuous movement. This fast pace was different and more in your face than the likes of Alfred Hitchcock or Stanley Kubrick, which led audiences to keep coming back, for now. The Blaxploitation era only lasted between 1971 to 1976, only 5 years, and there are two reasons for that. One, audiences got tired of the same shtick. It no longer was the cool new movie, and the oversaturation of the genre meant quality dwindled. And two, Blaxploitation films had a lot of criticism and controversy. So why did this new empowering movement in the film industry garner such negative views from audiences and critics? Well, it comes down to the representation of the main character. Many blaxploitation films follow black men who are pimps or convicts, and what this did was create an illusion that all black men were like the typical stereotypes they were fighting against. Many critics such as Harvard psychiatrist Alvin Poussin and Jesse Jackson wanted to challenge the filmmakers to change the types of characters they were creating and instead choose to focus the film on a black main character that can become a role model to communities. One of those films that was heavily criticised was Gordon Parks Jr.'s Superfly, released in 1972, which starred Ron O'Neal, who played a cocaine-dealing priest. Ebony writer B.J. Mason said this about the film: "An insidious film which portrays the black community at its worst. It glorifies the use of cocaine and casts blacks in roles which glorify dope pushers, pimps, and grand theft." And it wasn't just critics that had a negative word about blaxploitation films. The NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and National Urban League joined forces to form the Coalition Against Blaxploitation. Their movement garnered national interest. They wanted to stop what they thought was offensive stereotypes in these films. And it was this movement that fast-tracked the death of blaxploitation films in 1976. But the impact of those 5 years was already made to the future black filmmakers. Spike Lee and John Singleton began a renaissance with the genre in the late 80s and early 90s with such movies as Do the Right Thing and Boys in the Hood, both using the trademarks of blaxploitation films but adding in elements of criticism of the genre itself, thus beginning a new wave. But the films didn't just influence black filmmakers, it also had a huge influence on white ones too, with the most notable being Quentin Tarantino, with characters such as Jules in Pulp Fiction, and Quentin's third film Jackie Brown, which was basically a love letter to legendary film actress Pam Grier. So the genre never truly died. In the 2000s, we also had a Shaft reboot starring Samuel L. Jackson and director Scott Sanders' Black Dynamite in 2009. Other films that were influenced by blaxploitation movies include Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, Malcolm D. Lee's Undercover Brother, and in 2019 we had Eddie Murphy play Rudy Ray Moore in Dolomite Is My Name. The films have also influenced the music industry, with such singers as Snoop Dogg and Ice-T adopting that pimp persona that was heavily used in many blaxploitation movies. So the impact of blaxploitation films continued throughout time. The era was short and had many critics for its portrayal of black men, but the impact it created and the inspiration it gave to a lot of black filmmakers is undeniable, and that should be celebrated. The movies broke a culture that white actors can only play leads, and in those 5 years that culture was shattered with over 200 films made between 1971 to 1976. Sure, they were violent and sexual, but they gave African Americans a voice in a very white establishment. And as Todd Boyce said, a professor at USC School of Cinematic Arts, the idea was that these movies were giving voices to people that didn't have a voice. They became, in a way, figures that were heroic to regular people. Blaxploitation films may have ended in 1976, but the influence has transcended that time to now, a time very similar to 1971, the year that started the blaxploitation era of film.